It was winter in northwestern Louisiana, 1897, under a sky the color of old silver and cold as regret. The silence of the town settled early, long before sundown, when every window lit up with the orange lamps that tried and often failed to keep the dark at bay. Here in a white-clapboard house on the edge of the willow woods, Ruth Ellery's name was spoken with the kind of unease reserved for natural disasters. She was to all the widow Ellery, young enough to remarry, but marked by something too fierce and sorrowful to let anyone close. The town itself lived on the Mississippi's backroads, a place where everyone knew more about their neighbors than they claimed to. Most men worked the cane fields or the heavy timber yards. Women, like Ruth, tended to long porches and slow-boiling secrets. But even amongst expert gossips, Ruth's rituals set her apart. She always dressed in black even in the sticky months, her eyes fixed on the river when she thought nobody was watching. Only she was never really alone. If someone happened to wake late in the night, say a dog barking or a baby crying, they might catch through a parted curtain the flicker of Ruth's lantern. Always without fail in the frostbitten weeks after Thanksgiving, she set out alone toward the Ellery family plot, a battered shovel in hand. No one dared follow. That was the first rule of living near Ruth Ellery. But every morning that followed her midnight walks, there would be fresh earth overturned beside her husband's grave. And always boot marks leading back to her house, a sharp path in the dew and the cold. Had she loved him so fiercely in life? Or was it guilt that returned her to the grave year after year? People speculated, but never to her face. Ruth's grief was a wild dog, dangerous and able to bite. The locals pretended to care for her, offering pies and jars of preserves, but the truth was that people kept their children tight at sundown and their distance at all hours. Ruth Ellery came to Louisiana with her husband, Ezra, 3 years prior by way of Tennessee. They were outsiders but known for their ambition. Ezra managed a lumber mill, Ruth sewed fine smocks and read by lamplight. Their love had a private quality, fiercely protective but never boastful. Yet not long after their arrival, Ezra died suddenly, found at the river's edge with lungs full of mud and skin bruised black around the neck and jaw. The coroner called it an accident. Ruth did not speak publicly of her loss, never shed a tear where anyone could see, but in the months that followed she lost weight and grew haunted. The townsfolk waited for her to wither. Instead, Ruth seemed to grow sharper, her eyes clearer, her movements more purposeful. Whispers followed, but she ignored them. It was the second winter after Ezra's death, when Ruth was first seen at his grave in the night. Her shawl pulled over her hair, boots crunching over frost, she dug with slow measured effort. The next day the grave was always resealed, as if nothing had happened. The pattern repeated every winter unfailingly. Neighbors whispered about curses, old family feuds, or deeds that could not rest. Some were convinced Ruth was mad. Others, like old Mr. Guidry, insisted she was hiding some deep, ugly truth, perhaps having killed her husband herself. But no evidence emerged, no authorities intervened, and Ruth, for her part, cared little for public sentiment. Her house remained eerily neat. A constant fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of baking bread floated on the cold air, masking any trace of soil. Ruth moved through her days with a quiet, rigid grace, a widow in perpetual, controlled mourning, and all the while winter would come, and so would the digging. It was on one such winter morning, dark clouds pressing low, that a young boy named Gabriel ventured past the graveyard gate. He was 14, braver than most, and dared himself to inspect the ground by Ezra Ellery's grave. He found not only the expected loosened earth, but something more. A piece of torn black cloth snagged upon a root, and a small object buried just beneath the surface, a plain silver locket smeared with mud. Inside the locket, there was a faded photograph, not of Ruth and Ezra, but of another man unknown to Gabriel. The discovery passed quietly from him to his mother, and from her into the undercurrent of town rumors. Who was the stranger? And why was Ruth, year after year, risking everything to disturb her husband's grave? Had she buried something or someone else with Ezra? Or was she searching for something that had been taken from her? Ruth never spoke of the past, nor of the nights she vanished into the cold. But as the days grew shorter and the silence thicker, the town's curiosity stretched thin, taut as wire. Something had to give. Behind locked doors and closed curtains, People speculated about what winter would bring. As the first snow crept through the willows, Ruth lit her lantern, donned her black shawl and stepped once again toward the family plot, unaware that this time she would not be alone. That winter, the wind howled through the cane fields with a voice as hollow as memory, stripping leaves from the willow groves behind Ruth Ellery's lonely house. Most neighbors barricaded themselves indoors, peering into the dusk from behind curtains. But this year something was different. At the edge of the graveyard, Gabriel, the brave boy, returned, clutching the silver locket that had churned rumors deep into the cold ground of the town. Gabriel's mother held that locket in trembling hands, opening it again and again, studying the faint image inside. The man beside Ruth in the miniature photograph wore a smile distant and shadowed, as if he'd been standing in fog. His features resembled no one in town. That single detail, passed from neighbor to neighbor, bloomed into unease. Who could he be, this stranger wrapped into Ruth's secret and Ezra's grave? Ruth noticed the shift. She could sense the eyes tracking her when she walked to the market, the silence that buzzed behind every brief greeting. Her own gaze grew sharper. Each night before the digging, she stood for a moment at her window, watching the slow lights glittering in distant houses. She felt a challenge rising in the frost. If someone dared to trespass, what would they discover? As January deepened, a local constable named Marshal Henley took an interest in the case. He was methodical, suspicious by nature, never given to the feverish gossip that fueled small towns. Henley questioned Ruth discreetly, asking about her annual walks to the grave, her late husband's health, and the locket that Gabriel had found. Ruth answered each question with quiet dignity. She was precise. Her words weighed more than the silence, and she shared nothing beyond the facts demanded. The locket, she said, belonged to Ezra, but she could not recall the origin of the photograph within. Henley was persistent. He visited the grave by daylight, studying every patch of earth. At his feet the ground was colder, freshly disturbed, but he found nothing beyond the usual churn. Half-rotted weeds, stones uprooted, clumps of mud pressed by small boots. Still something gnawed at him, an absence in Ruth's story, a detail just out of reach. The townsfolk, emboldened by the marshal's attention, grew restless. Some demanded answers. Others prayed for rumors to fade. Ruth, meanwhile, grew even quieter, seeming to shrink into herself as the weeks slackened. Sometimes she visited the river, staring at its slow current until dusk cracked into night. Old Mr. Guidry, now almost 80, stepped forward with his own tale. He claimed to have seen Ruth and Ezra arguing days before Ezra's death. Guidry described hearing raised voices on the porch, a glass shattered against the wood. Was their marriage troubled, he wondered aloud, or was Ruth simply haunted by loss? The town latched onto the story, layering suspicion onto Ruth's solitude. Every word Mr. Guidry spoke seemed to add a new shadow to her reputation. This mounting tension reached its peak on a night when Ruth, lantern in hand, made her way as usual toward the family plot. What she didn't know was that Gabriel, driven by restless curiosity, followed at a distance. His breath steamed in the cold, his heart thumping as he struggled to keep silent footsteps behind her. As Ruth knelt at the grave, Gabriel watched from the shadows, his hands shaking. Ruth worked with slow deliberation, prying up wet earth, her movements never hurried. She paused, breathing hard, and reached into the ground, not for Ezra's body, but for a small bundled package. Gabriel froze. Had she buried something? Some proof beyond the reach of daylight? Ruth opened the bundle. Inside was another photograph, crumpled and faded. Gabriel gasped, stepping on a stick. Ruth spun, lantern light lancing through the dark. Her voice was cold, almost gentle, as she called out, "Who's there?" Gabriel hesitated, then stepped forward, locket raised, face pale. Ruth regarded him for a long moment. The only sound was the wind and the creak of Gabriel's boots. Finally, Ruth knelt, holding out the photograph. "Is this what you're looking for?" She whispered. Gabriel nodded, unable to speak. Ruth's eyes were fierce, but her shoulders shook. She pressed the photograph into his hand. "You're braver than most," she said. Ruth stood, lifting the lantern high. She was not angry. She seemed almost relieved. "You want to know why I dig? This land, this grave, it belongs to memories nobody wants. I come here because I owe the dead a promise. Ezra was killed, not drowned. Someone in this town knows, but nobody speaks. Gabriel's breath caught. Ruth, lantern held steady, walked back toward her house, leaving the grave open behind her. The next morning, the whole town buzzed with news. Gabriel talked, unable to keep his secret. Ruth had been seen, the story went, unearthing more than sorrow. Perhaps evidence, perhaps vengeance. Marshal Henley listened, his eyes narrowing. From that day, Ruth found herself watched from every window and porch. The cane fields whispered her name, while the river seemed to slow out of respect or fear. Ruth, undeterred, baked bread and read by firelight, her mind a fortress of old pain. And when winter threatened its final, icy grip, Ruth prepared for one last midnight walk, knowing this would be either the end of secrets or the birth of new ones. Louisiana's cold nights gave way only reluctantly to dawn, and Ruth Ellery felt every hour pass as though the world itself were weighing her down. In town, the fevered speculation had shifted, no longer merely about her grief or strange rituals, but about the prospect of a secret revealed at last. Marshal Henley's interest had emboldened those who longed for closure, but Ruth, the quiet widow, remained an enigma none could solve. The story of Gabriel's midnight venture spread fast, like fire through dry cane. Children repeated the tale in hushed voices. Adults dissected each detail over the breakfast table. Many wondered if Ruth, year after year, unearthed evidence to punish the living or to plead with the dead. The silver locket had become talismanic, exchanged between hands as a piece of the puzzle no one could fit together. Behind closed doors, Ruth endured relentless scrutiny. She could feel the collective gaze of the town settling on her with every trip to the bakery and every lull at the riverbank. Even the grocer, friendly in summers past, had taken to short-clipped interactions. The isolation that had once felt like a shield now pressed in like a cell. One Sunday, as the church bell tolled, Ruth sat alone in the back pew. She listened to sermons on forgiveness and resurrection, her hands neatly folded in her lap. But her mind wandered, drifting between memories of Tennessee and the bitter years in Louisiana. She remembered Ezra's laughter before it soured, the tension that built after he returned home less each night. She remembered the night he died, the bruises the coroner named accidental, the sounds in the house that only she heard. That evening, Henley invited Ruth for tea, ostensibly to discuss Gabriel's story. At his humble, birdsong-filled cottage, under the gaze of a lone oil lamp, they talked at length. The constable sought clarity. Ruth, for the first time, did not deflect. She described Ezra's growing panic, the letters he received marked in a stranger's hand. She admitted to arguments but denied true violence. Ezra, she said, was terrified of something outside their home, a debt or a promise made before they came to Louisiana. Henley took notes, mostly silent. Ruth watched him, searching his face for trust or contempt. She saw neither, only genuine concern. When she rose to leave, he made a quiet promise. "I'll try to put the ghosts to rest, Ruth, but you have to tell me everything." On her walk home, Ruth considered what it might mean to reveal every detail. Would the living accept her truth? Would she only shift the town's blame from her shoulders onto another's, or would her burden finally lessen? Meanwhile, Gabriel was consumed with guilt. Though his mother praised his bravery, Ruth's haunted eyes had left him feeling hollow. Questions spun through his head. Had Ezra truly been murdered? Could Ruth be covering for someone else, or was she herself guilty of more than sorrow? The tension reached its peak as colder winds returned. One evening, an anonymous letter appeared on Ruth's porch, tucked beneath a chipped stone. Its message was blunt, scrawled in an uneven hand. "Let the dead lie. We know." Ruth turned the note over and burned it silently, her resolve darkening. That same night, Ruth sat in her parlor, staring at the locket Gabriel had found. Her fingers traced its edge, memories rushing back, not of Ezra but of another face entirely, the photograph she'd kept hidden for years. She knew then that the last winter walk would not be one of mourning, but of confrontation. The truth had to surface, even if it shattered the fragile peace the town maintained. As midnight fell, Ruth dressed in black once more, lantern in hand. She paused on the porch, taking in the brittle air, then strode determinedly to the graveyard. This time the moon was high and shadows writhed in the grass. Unbeknownst to Ruth, she was not alone. Henley, intent on resolving the mystery, trailed her, his own steps muffled by the damp. Ruth knelt beside Ezra's grave, digging with purpose. Henley approached, watching as she unearthed another bundle. Inside, tightly bound, lay letters, dozens of them, in the same faded hand that marked Ezra's final weeks. Henley stepped into the lantern's glow. Ruth flinched, startled, but did not drop her shovel. "I need to see those," Henley said quietly. Resigned, Ruth handed them over. The constable read by lantern light, words heavy with accusations, confessions, and threats. Ezra, it seemed, had been involved in something far beyond marital strife. A failed venture, debts to men who could not be named. The letters spoke of fear, warnings, and a bond that might have led ultimately to Ezra's demise. Henley promised to investigate further. Ruth watched him go, finally allowing herself to weep as she returned earth atop Ezra's grave. For the first time, she felt that the gravity of her actions was shifting, that the truth, painful as it was, might be enough to appease the dead and the living alike. As dawn broke, Ruth remained at her window, eyes on the cane fields, her heart battered but just a little lighter. The winter was far from over, and so too was her reckoning. The turn of the new year in Louisiana's countryside brought not hope, but bitter cold and a growing unrest. The cane fields stood bare. Rough winds rattled the thin window panes of every home, while rumors about Ruth Ellery still echoed along muddy roads and market aisles. Now they mingled with deeper anxieties that clouded the town's heart, a dread shaped by history and violence as much as by local scandal. Ruth awoke in her narrow bed, the dawn offering only grey light and the promise of another day on trial before her neighbors. But today, as she rose, she found something different outside. A red X marked in chalk on her gatepost. For a long moment she stood still, knowing what it meant. In these parts, such a mark was a warning, a relic from times when mob justice, not the law, settled disputes and suspicions. Ruth closed her fist around the locket, her mind sharpening with resolve. Inside her kitchen, her hands worked through familiar rituals, grinding coffee, kneading dough, watching the sun try and fail to warm the bare yard beyond. She remembered the world before Louisiana, its freedoms and its losses. Here every interaction seemed tainted by the unspoken rules of a state where secrets, debts, and grudges outlived truth. It was a place where justice more often wore the mask of revenge, and grief could be a death sentence in itself. Marshal Henley returned at midday, his hat dusted with frost, his boots caked in mud. He carried a new stack of documents, copies of Ezra's letters and business records, old receipts scraped up from the town's archive, even a weathered photograph from the sheriff's files. He laid them on Ruth's table with care. "They haven't forgotten," he said softly, nodding at the haunted window. "And neither have I. Was Ezra the man they think, Ruth? Or could he have crossed someone even worse?" "He was running," Ruth replied, her voice a thread. "From debt, yes, but more from shame. He took money from men who wouldn't let him leave. When he tried, they made him pay." Henley's eyes narrowed. The gravest crime in places like this wasn't always theft or even murder, but the breach of loyalty to the unspoken codes that governed river and field alike. The letters made it plain. Ezra had borrowed, gambled, and eventually betrayed someone who dealt in silence, not forgiveness. Ruth's midnight vigils were penance and perhaps a safeguard. Every winter, she made sure no one had tampered with Ezra's burial, that the threats lying dormant in the earth stayed hidden. Henley promised to keep vigil himself. He'd seen what these warnings could mean: a lynch mob, the law failing for lack of will or evidence, another life ruined by the violence that history had taught the town to accept. The cold crept in again, but now it carried the hint of action. In the days that followed, Ruth's house became a fortress. She watched as men clustered at the general store, their voices bitter, their glances sharper than knives. Children hurried indoors when she passed, and Gabriel, usually bold, kept his distance. By the light of her kitchen lamp, she read and reread Ezra's letters. They told the story of a man desperate and afraid, willing to risk everything for a chance to start anew. Yet every plan led back to the river, the debts growing heavier, the threats clearer. The final letter chilled Ruth. It warned that if Ezra couldn't keep quiet, neither would his woman. She realized then that her own life had been at risk not only from gossip, but from those who once threatened her husband. One cold evening, Henley returned, urgency written across his face. "They're planning something, Ruth. I heard them at the back of Ellery's barn. If you have more to say, now's the time." "The law won't be swift enough." Ruth swallowed hard. I never killed him, but I did bury the truth. I was afraid. If I spoke, they'd come for me too. Henley nodded. If we're to end this, we need more than secrets. We need someone willing to speak out. Those men, Ellery, Boudreau, even the preacher, they wanted silence. Ezra tried to leave their circle. He couldn't. With a trembling resolve, Ruth agreed to testify, to share the story with the court if Henley could guarantee her safety. It was a risk, but carrying the burden alone was killing her by slow degrees. Henley set off, gathering signatures and statements, assembling a case by lamplight and whispered oaths. Ruth, left alone again, felt hope and terror braid together inside her, threading her past to the uncertain future. The winter grew harsher still, the night winds shriller. But in Ruth's kitchen, a single coal glowed, a stubborn ember that refused to die out. In the weeks that followed, tension in the town climbed relentlessly, mirroring the iron-fisted grip of Louisiana's winter. Every neighbor, every merchant and field hand seemed battered by suspicion and by the old deep rules that governed their lives. Homes huddled beneath gabled roofs, bundled against the cold and against the threat that secrets, once revealed, might ultimately consume them all. Ruth Ellery marked the days by the sound of church bells and the whine of the north wind. She watched with a patient resolve as the sheriff's men slowly gathered testimonies and written accounts. Their efforts were clumsy. Few in the town trusted outsiders or the law, and those who spoke did so in whispers, weighing every word as though it could summon real, mortal danger. It wasn't only Ruth's burden. Gabriel, whose childhood curiosity had turned to regret, now struggled with loneliness. Where once he'd run wild through fields and backyards, he was now treated like the keeper of a dark truth. Mothers hushed their children when he entered a room. His friends, not daring to ask what he'd witnessed, orbited him in silence, as if his presence might bring down curses. Marshal Henley, more determined than ever, worked late into the night, often at Ruth's kitchen table, bent over correspondence and ledgers. He catalogued every time Ezra's name appeared in the town's troubles: debts unpaid, a partnership dissolved, tension between old families and new outsiders. The patterns pointed to a shadowy network of men who wielded more power than the sheriff or any lawman, men who operated on loyalty and threatened silence. Henley warned Ruth, "They'll fight back. When the law exposes what's been hidden, they'll find scapegoats. Stand firm." She nodded, fragile but steadfast. Isolation, that old cloak, sheltered and suffocated her in equal measure. One morning, news rippled through the mulberry groves and along the banks of the swelling river. Someone had broken into Ruth's home. Bread sat untasted on the table. Books, letters, and Ezra's few remaining possessions were in disarray. Yet nothing was taken except the locket and one letter, the most damning of all. Ruth sat for hours in the cold parlor, fists clenched, barely breathing as townsfolk chattered outside. She understood suddenly that what she'd taken for community was only a fragile armistice, one breakable by a single night's trespass. As dusk fell, Marshal Henley arrived, discovering Ruth frozen in her sorrow and rage. He inspected the damage and promised protection, but even he knew that the law was only as strong as the will of those who believed in it. That night, Ruth lit an extra lamp in every window. "I will not hide anymore," she whispered, letting the light speak on her behalf. She hoped other women in town, trapped by silence and fear, might see and draw hope from her defiance. Meanwhile, those who opposed Ruth's quest for the truth gathered in Ellery's barn, a crude council of men who peddled influence as surely as they traded grain. Angry voices declared that Ruth was endangering the legacy of the town, threatening to bring down men whose secrets had always posed more risk when exposed. Some demanded Ruth be driven out for good, but the tide had begun to shift. For every threat Ruth endured, a handful of people quietly rallied in her defense. Women who'd lost sons to river debts, farmers bankrupted by partners like Ezra, young men eager for change, even if it came at the expense of peace. A sense of solidarity, faint but real, took root. Henley persisted. He built alliances with ministers, teachers, and elderly townsfolk. He urged them to speak, to testify in front of the judge who would arrive for the winter assizes. Letters from other communities, records from as far away as Shreveport, underscored the reach of Ezra's entanglements. The story grew beyond Ruth. becoming a referendum on truth, survival, and the hard labor of justice in rural Louisiana. Gabriel, though frightened, found himself drawn to Ruth's courage. One morning, he knocked on her door bearing bread and a note of apology written in a trembling hand. Ruth smiled, an honest smile for the first time since Ezra's death, and invited the boy in. They ate in silence, but it was the silence of kinship, not suspicion. Over the next days, Ruth worked with Henley, using her knowledge of the town's hidden codes to help build a case. She recounted each winter she'd spent at the grave, and what she'd found or not found each time. She confessed her fears about the men whose names Ezra had whispered in terror, and her own guilt for not protecting him more. Winter's end was on the horizon. As Ruth prepared to stand before the town, she felt the change. No longer only the outsider, the widow or the accused. She was now a witness and a voice, one meant to break the grip that secrets had held over so many for so long. With this resolve, Ruth stepped out as the bells tolled once again, her steps steady and her heart braced for what would follow. The sound of church bells echoed across the icy fields as Ruth Ellery made her way to the modest building that would serve as the courtroom for the winter assizes. The town gathered in cautious silence, uneasy beneath the authority of the traveling judge and uncertain lawman. In rural Louisiana, justice was never straightforward. It was tangled in custom, fear, and the reluctant trust placed in outsiders who came to adjudicate their tangled affairs. Outside, chickens pecked at frost, and children clung to their mothers' skirts. Sensing the tension that blanketed the morning, Ruth took her seat near the front, back straight, eyes set forward. At her side, Marshal Henley stood as a rare ally, one of the few men willing to risk his reputation to see justice served without favor or malice. Inside, the informal court assembled. The judge, a stern man from Opelousas, spoke with gravity about law and tradition. He explained the peculiar blend of American and French civil codes that informed Louisiana's judicial process, quoting statutes and old cases with quiet authority. But even as he spoke, the mood in the room remained heavy. No one quite believed justice could outrun the weight of local alliances and grudges. Henley presented the case in measured words. He recounted Ezra's troubled business affairs, the threats delivered in letters, and the testimony collected from Ruth, Gabriel, and others willing to speak. He named the men whose anger at Ezra's betrayal had grown into vengeance. He outlined how Ruth's winter visits to the grave, once a matter of local scorn, were acts of protection and penance. Each year she checked that the sins buried with Ezra had not been disturbed or desecrated. Ruth, when called, stepped to the front. Her voice was clear, trembling only once as she described the final days before Ezra's death and the fears that drove her husband to desperation. She shared the letters, the contents chilling even to the most hardened men in the room. Threats against her, warnings that any betrayal would be punished not only in life, but in death. The men accused Ellery, Boudreau, and the preacher, among others, sat in stony silence. Their lawyers argued that Ruth's story was nothing but a widow's grief turned to suspicion, the last gasp of a woman desperate for closure. They cited the lack of witnesses to murder, the ambiguity of the evidence, and the traditions of the parish. The judge listened, face impassive. He questioned Ruth gently about her loneliness, her isolation, the years she spent keeping vigil in the winter cold. Gabriel's testimony followed. The boy's honest confusion and fear won sympathy from many in the crowd. He described the locket, the midnight ritual, and Ruth's confession by the grave. His words painted a portrait of a town where truth was an orphan, cared for only by the brave. Henley wrapped up the arguments, appealing not just to law, but to the conscience of those gathered. He spoke of courage, Ruth's and Gabriel's, and the need to break the cycles of fear and corruption that had knotted the town's history for generations. For several long hours, the town waited while the judge reviewed the evidence and deliberated with local officials. Some prayed, others whispered. Outside, clouds gathered, promising rain or sleet before spring. When the judge returned, the sentence was neither dramatic nor cruel. The accused were fined and subjected to public scrutiny, exposed at last for the web of debts and threats they had woven. But for Ruth there was no jail, no pillory, no humiliation. Her actions, born of grief and necessity, were recognized not as crimes, but as desperate acts of survival and justice. Ruth left the courthouse with her head high, guarded by Henley, and watched by neighbors who, for the first time, wondered if they owed her an apology. Winter's cold remained, but its grip on Ruth's heart had loosened. She was bruised, not broken, and the seeds of trust, thin as new grass, had begun to take root in the parish soil. That night, candles glowed in Ruth's windows. She baked bread for Gabriel, who visited at dusk, and for Henley, who walked the quiet streets with a sense of pride and relief. The silence of the town was different, tinged with possibility. Justice in rural Louisiana was never simple, but for Ruth Ellery, the winter of her reckoning had finally begun to thaw. The mood in the town transformed with the passing verdict. Ruth Ellery, once marooned by suspicion and grief, now moved through the muddy streets as though restored to her own body. There were eyes everywhere, some curious, some guilty, but the weight that had bent her shoulders season after season seemed at last to ease. Marshal Henley kept his promise, checking on Ruth daily. Their conversations shifted from urgent whispers to quiet reassurances. They spoke of Ezra's last months, of the debts and the betrayals, and of the way justice, rough, improvised, but necessary, could sometimes serve those the law had once crushed. Rural Louisiana's justice was always colored by its past, its mix of codes and customs, as tangled as the willows by the riverbanks. In this place, the scars of slavery, poverty, and vigilante violence ran deep, with wounds often left untended beneath the soil web sextum. As spring threatened to break winter's hold, Ruth turned her attention to the other women of the parish. She found herself at their tables and doorways, listening to their stories of loss and endurance. They shared small kindnesses, fresh eggs, mended linens, the company of children when her own home felt too silent. For the first time, Ruth no longer felt like a trespasser in her neighbor's world. Gabriel, whose courage and guilt had started so much of the town's reckoning, grew into himself. He became a regular visitor, no longer whispering apologies but listening and learning. Ruth saw in him a kind of hope unburdened by the dead weight of salt-rusted secrets. The town tried to make sense of all that had happened. Those who had once pressed Ruth from their front porches now offered nods and sometimes invitations. Some apologies came in the form of shy glances, others in halting words. Henley assured her, "People here remember everything. They also know how to forget when it suits them, but not all wounds closed cleanly." There were those, men who'd felt the judge's verdict most sharply, who simmered with resentment. In the long shadows of Giori's barn, plans may have been hatched, but nothing came of them. Henley's reputation, and the eyes of those whose voices had finally been heard, discouraged any open retaliation. The balance between law and local custom remained uneasy. Ruth knew how easily fear could tilt the scales again. As the weather softened, Ruth returned to the fields and her old garden beds. She watched new shoots break through the tired earth, marveling at their persistence. The rhythm of small-town life carried her forward. Market mornings, sewing for the preacher's wife, the laughter of children in the near distance. The scars remained, but in their place was a kind of strength newly forged. One evening, sitting on her porch, Ruth reread one of Ezra's last letters. He had written, "In another life I would have brought you peace." She thought of Ezra not as the man whose death held her in chains, but as a part of the long story she now carried differently, not hidden at night, but presented to the world in the clear light of day. That spring, Ruth's house filled with visitors. Some came in friendship, others in search of answers, still others bearing awkward gifts. She welcomed them one by one, her hair streaked with more gray but her gaze undimmed. News of Ruth's case, and of how the town had almost devoured its own conscience in punishing the wrong villain, spread to surrounding parishes. A traveling reporter stopped by, hoping for a tale of murder and ghosts. Ruth met him briefly and told him, "This isn't a story about the dead. It's about how hard it is to live sometimes with the truth." Against the brightening landscape, the river thawed, reflecting sunlight in dazzling ribbons. The willow trees stretched toward the sky, fresh and green, as if the world itself was preparing to begin again. The story of Ruth Ellery lingered in Louisiana's humid air, a caution, a comfort, a signal that even in the most tangled and brutal places, renewal was possible. Ruth no longer visited Ezra's grave at night. She found peace walking there in the earliest morning, when the fields were quiet and the frost forgotten. In these first peaceful days, With justice delivered and the last winter behind her, Ruth was finally able to look forward rather than back. Spring swept through northwestern Louisiana like an old memory coming back to life. The cane fields grew green and unruly. Wildflowers erupted along the road margins, where Ruth Ellery now walked with her face tilted to the gentle sun. The town, marked and reshaped by a winter unlike any in living memory, began to breathe again, cautiously, hopefully. Ruth's days drifted into new patterns. She woke early, sometimes before the birds, tending her small vegetable patch beside the white clapboard house. The garden, once a place of lonely ritual, blossomed into color and abundance. Gabriel helped her plant beans and okra, his quick hands and laughter bringing ease where there had only been empty silence. Neighbors stopped by more often. Some brought gossip and requests for advice. Others arrived simply to share breakfast or borrow a recipe. Ruth received a parcel of preserves from the preacher's wife and a hand-woven basket from Mrs. Guidry. The old lines of suspicion slowly faded, replaced by the soft bonds of community that came with mutual respect. Inside, Ruth saw her home transformed. Ezra's belongings, once shrines and reminders, were packed away. In their place were new signs of life: fresh bread on the windowsill, patchwork cushions, Gabriel's sketches on the parlor table. Ruth herself grew stronger, her movements less burdened, her voice steadier and warmer when she greeted visitors. Henley remained a steady figure in her life, less guardian now and more friend. They spoke on the porch about the town's odd customs, about the long reach of history and the fragile work of renewal. Ruth confided that she still felt echoes of old fear each winter, but also acknowledged a newfound courage, a will to claim her own place, to let go of shame. The court's verdict had planted seeds of change even beyond Ruth's quiet house. Families in the surrounding parishes heard of the trial, and some came seeking guidance or solace. Ruth never preached. She offered only her story, the lessons learned from digging up old secrets and surviving their telling. One morning, Gabriel arrived breathless with news. The town's children, once wary, now wanted Ruth to teach them to bake bread and tend gardens. Ruth agreed, her home echoing with young voices, sticky fingers, and laughter. The sour memory of suspicion seemed distant, replaced by the bright, chaotic energy of shared learning. As spring pressed toward summer, Ruth's story returned to the graveyard in gentler ways. She visited Ezra's grave in daylight, planting daisies and reading quietly beneath the willow branches. Her grief had changed, still deep but not consuming. She spoke to Ezra sometimes aloud, releasing guilt and anger into the earth, and finding in the ritual a measure of peace. The town itself revived. The market bustled, the church pews filled, and even Ellery's barn, once the hatching ground for darkness, hosted suppers and dances. The river, swollen with meltwater, ran fast and clear, as if sweeping away the last remnants of winter's burden. Ruth continued her walks, never hurried, always observant. She found pleasure in ordinary things: a new calf in Guidry's field, the scent of magnolia, the song of a blackbird at dusk. She rediscovered stories in the town's architecture: homes rebuilt, fences mended, old tools repurposed. Much as the LSU Rural Life Museum would one day commemorate, rural Louisiana was a world built by hands, resilience, and the stubborn hope of those who survived its hardest trials. Webhouse. Hindot Webrasin San Webast. At night, she sat with Gabriel and Henley by the fire, sharing dreams for the future. Ruth pondered opening a small bakery, inviting neighbors to work alongside her. Henley, thoughtful and careful, discussed founding a community watch, a measure against the silence and fear that once ruled the parish. Gabriel planned to paint a mural at the school, telling their story in bright colors, so no one would forget what winter had revealed. In the final days of spring, Ruth wrote a letter to her sister in Tennessee. She told at last the truth of Ezra's life and death and the gift of forgiveness that she now carried. She wished her family well and invited them to visit, no longer ashamed. The story of Ruth Ellery faded into legend as years passed. Some remembered only fragments: a widow who dug in the frost, a boy who braved the dark, a lawman who refused corruption. But for those who lived through it, the memory remained whole and vivid. A tale of a community transformed by pain, truth, and the long, arduous work of reconciliation. The next winter arrived with less dread. Ruth found comfort in the quiet, routine preparations: stacking wood, making stew, tending friendship. She dreamed rarely of graves now, and more often of gardens, laughter, and the light of morning in her windows. Thus ended the horrifying crimes, less in violence than in silence, less in death than in all that came after. Ruth Ellery, the widow who once faced the frozen earth alone, had become, finally, the center of a new story, one planted firmly in the living soil of rural Louisiana. The fields outside would bloom again, and so would she. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.